Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
They said they could only afford to send one child, and the way they said it was so casual, so final, as if it were a logical equation that could not be argued with. One child gets the experience of a lifetime, the other gets nothing. Guess who won the golden ticket? Not me. My brother, Daniel, sat at the head of the table that night with the kind of smug smile he had perfected since childhood, the kind that said, "Of course I deserve this." My parents beamed at him like he had just won the Nobel Prize, while I sat across from them, stirring a glass of water and pretending I hadn't just been erased from the family ledger yet again. The announcement came after dinner, when Mom set down her fork and clasped her hands as if she were about to deliver breaking news. "We've been saving, and we realized we can only send one of you," she said, her eyes darting toward Daniel with a warmth I had not seen directed at me in years. Dad nodded along, adding that money was tight and they wanted to make the responsible choice. I waited for someone to explain why responsibility meant rewarding the child who never cooked a meal, never lifted a hand to help, and never once thought twice about leaving dirty laundry across the floor like it was a trail for a rescue team. But of course, no explanation came. They just turned toward him, handed him a glossy brochure of the Mediterranean cruise, and smiled as if the whole universe had aligned just for him. Daniel slapped the table and said, finally, something that makes sense, his voice dripping with entitlement. He had barely skimmed the brochure before announcing he would need new luggage and probably a wardrobe upgrade too, because obviously a luxury cruise demanded nothing less than his usual bare minimum effort dressed up in expensive fabric. I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that isn't amusement at all, but the last line of defense against screaming. No one noticed. Sitting there, I realized this wasn't about money. It never was. We weren't a poor family scraping by on scraps. Dad had his pension, Mom had her side hustle, and Daniel himself had 2 part-time jobs he bragged about but never actually worked with consistency. This was about choice. They chose him again. They had always chosen him, birthday parties that turned into Daniel's spotlight, vacations where my requests were dismissed, college tuition they couldn't manage for me but somehow had when Daniel needed his courses covered. I was the background character, the extra in a movie where he played the lead. And the cruelest part was how normal it had become, like everyone silently agreed I was easier to ignore. I smiled that night, though. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt, clapped my hands like the world's most supportive sister, and even raised my glass in a mock toast. They laughed, relieved, convinced I was fine with it. But under the table, my fingernails dug crescents into my palms, and in my head, something sharp and relentless began to click into place. If I was going to be invisible, then I would use invisibility to my advantage. Later that night, while they buzzed around Daniel packing in their heads, I went upstairs and sat in my room staring at the posters I had taped to my walls years ago. My life had been a series of compromises, hand-me-down clothes, shared birthday cakes, unacknowledged achievements, but this cruise announcement, was a different kind of insult. It wasn't just that they left me behind. It was that they expected me to sit still, clap politely, and keep waiting for crumbs while they handed him the feast. Something inside me hardened. I thought about the years of my savings tucked into the metal box at the back of my closet, money I had earned from summer jobs, tutoring kids who barely listened, and long shifts where my feet throbbed by the time I got home. Every cent I had carefully put away for my future sat just meters away, unprotected, unnoticed by the people who claimed to love me. They had never asked how much I had saved, never cared enough to check, because in their eyes, my ambitions weren't real. That night, as I stared at the dull reflection of my face in the window, I realized I was sitting on the only real power I had ever built for myself. At breakfast the next morning, Daniel bragged about how he was going to spend his days lying on the deck of the ship, flirting with girls, and eating at buffets that made normal food look like dog scraps. My parents laughed at his jokes, Dad promising to buy him a camera to document the trip, Mom promising to iron his shirts so he looked presentable. I buttered a piece of toast in silence, each scrape of the knife against bread ringing louder in my ears than their laughter. By the time Daniel turned to me and said, "You'll be fine holding down the fort here, right?" I had already made my decision. I nodded and said, "Of course. Someone has to keep this place standing." They all chuckled, assuming I meant it as a joke. I didn't correct them. Why would I? The beauty of being the ignored child is that no one expects you to matter, so when you finally do, the shock leaves them speechless. That day, I began to map out the details. I wouldn't confront them. I wouldn't beg for fairness. I wouldn't scream at their faces or make dramatic speeches they'd forget the moment the cruise ship sailed. Instead, I would wait. I would let them leave with their smiles and their plans and their cruel little hierarchy. Then I would make sure, when they returned, that the house they came back to wasn't the same one they had left behind. For the rest of the week, I played my role perfectly. I teased Daniel about getting seasick, wished him luck charming strangers, and even helped Mom fold his clothes into the suitcase. They never once noticed the shift in me, never once paused to wonder what was simmering just under my polite surface. Their blindness was almost a gift, because it allowed me to prepare without suspicion. And when the night before their departure came, I stood at the door of Daniel's room, watching him pack like a king preparing for coronation, and I thought to myself, let him go enjoy the cruise. When he comes back, the entire kingdom will be ashes. I clapped along with them that night, smiling wide, but in my head the ticking had become a countdown. In the days that followed the dinner announcement, the house turned into a spinning carousel of lists and errands and upbeat music from Mom's kitchen speaker, and while they choreographed Daniel's departure like a coronation parade, I moved through rooms with a softness that no one ever noticed, collecting in my mind not just the things that had always been mine, but the patterns that proved how easily I had been written out of our family's budget and our family story. I was the one who replaced the router when it died, the one who paid for the streaming accounts everyone used, the one who bought the set of knives Dad bragged about to his friends, the one who covered the emergency plumber when the downstairs bathroom turned into a fountain, and I realized with a kind of clear, almost clinical calm that they had been drawing from my well for years while telling me I should be grateful for the chance to carry the buckets. Daniel strutted through the hallway with shirts draped over both arms, asking whether linen wrinkled on cruise ships in the same way it wrinkled on land, which he thought was a legitimate question. While Dad fumbled with a new camera that beeped like a needy toy and Mom waved a sheet of packing tips printed in a font so cheerful it made my jaw ache, and I offered small, precise suggestions in a voice that sounded helpful while my brain ran a parallel operation, clocking the locations of my documents, verifying the balance in the metal box without opening it, and mapping the shortest route to the bank that would convert cash into something safer if the wind in this family suddenly shifted into a storm. It wasn't fear I was feeling, not really, but the cold alertness that comes when you finally accept the truth, and once the truth entered the room it sat down like an unexpected guest, looked me straight in the eye, and said that the only person who had ever reliably chosen me was me. The first small revenge arrived wrapped in practical kindness, because that was the language they understood from me, and because it was almost funny how easily they let me carry their stress while they ignored the source of mine. When Dad misplaced the little pouch with the passports, he exploded into that familiar, booming panic that always ended with me fixing things, and I waited just long enough to let the air thicken before walking to the laundry room, sliding open the drawer where I knew Mom stashed things she swore she didn't stash, and producing the pouch with a straight face that suggested miracles were casual events in my presence. Then watched as relief washed over them so completely that they didn't even notice me slipping a sheet of paper onto the counter and asking, ever so gently, if Dad could sign this quick acknowledgement for the bank that my savings were my own. A boring housekeeping note so the teller wouldn't give me trouble, just a signature to save me time later. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, just a line that said in the dullest possible language that the money stored in my name belonged to me and only me. He signed without reading, which was both predictable and, in its way, heartbreaking. Because the man who would have drafted a peace treaty with a magnifying glass couldn't be bothered to glance at a sentence protecting his daughter's future when the passports needed to be found right now. That quiet little paper felt like a hinge turning under my feet, and I folded it into my wallet with the care of someone sealing an envelope addressed to a life she had not yet dared to imagine. then kept moving through the charade with a calm that bordered on sport. I ironed Daniel's shirts with deliberate strokes while mentally listing everything in the house I had purchased or maintained or rescued from neglect. I compared luggage locks while checking rental prices for a storage unit not far from the airport, and when Mom asked if I could be a sweetheart and pick up the travel-sized toiletries because Daniel didn't have time, I took the car keys with a smile and detoured to the bank, where the cashier did not ask questions, did not look surprised, did not require any secret handshake beyond the signature that matched the one on the new little statement in my wallet. I walked out lighter in spirit and heavier in conviction, and on the drive home I rehearsed not explanations or defenses, but the rhythm of leaving, because when you grow up as the second choice you waste too many years shaping speeches that fall apart in the air, and I had finally learned that the most eloquent statement is a closed door. That evening I performed another tiny, elegant piece of payback that looked like care and felt like balance. Daniel had ordered a new pair of leather shoes with the expectation that I would break them in for him because apparently I had the right feet for his discomfort, so I took them out of the box, slipped my feet inside long enough to confirm they were comfortable out of the gate, then swapped the insoles for the good ones I had purchased for myself months ago and never used because he had called them unnecessary, leaving him the standard liners that would still serve him fine while I finally took possession of something designed to support a person who actually walked the difficult miles. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't even expensive, it was simply the correction of a tiny tilt in the universe, and when I tucked my new insoles into the shoes I wore to long shifts, I felt a click of private satisfaction that needed no audience. On the last night before departure, the house hummed with the energy of the trip as if a power plant had been installed in our living room, and I made one more adjustment that no one would notice until much later. A breadcrumb tossed into the grass, not to be found but to be felt. I set up a simple email filter on the shared family inbox, a relic of Mom's obsession with coupons, so that any message with my name rolled gently into a folder only I could see. And then I scheduled a polite, generic announcement from my personal account to arrive the afternoon after they boarded, a message that said I had taken some time away to reset and would be offline for a while, which was perfectly true and perfectly bland. A clean square of fabric over a knife blade. I packed my own bag with a precision born of repetition, documents, proof of funds, that signed slip folded with the care of a photograph, a small box of jewelry I had paid for in installments, a portable drive with the only photos I cared to keep, and I placed the metal box into a canvas tote that looked like laundry so convincingly that I laughed out loud in the quiet of my room, a low amused sound that tasted like courage. When the morning finally arrived, I brewed coffee for everyone, carried suitcases to the trunk, and waved from the porch in a robe like a late-night sitcom neighbor, and as the car pulled away with honks and laughter and a last-minute reminder to water the potted basil, I stood there for one long inhalation that filled my ribs with something like oxygen and something like steel, then stepped back into the silent house and locked the door behind me with a firmness that felt like the first complete sentence I had spoken in years, because they had left me behind by design, but I had no intention of staying exactly where they put me, and by the time the ship's horn curved across the water, the invisible daughter they forgot to count would already be off their map. The silence in the house after their departure was not the peaceful kind that falls over a space when everyone is merely out running errands. It was the thick, resonant quiet of a stage once the curtain drops and the audience files away, leaving only the set pieces standing awkwardly in the glow of an empty theater. I walked from room to room with a deliberate pace, not rushing, not hesitating, just taking in the echo of their absence. And I realized that for the first time in years I was not competing with the sound of Daniel's voice filling the air like static or with my parents' laughter rising to meet his as if he were the only source of joy they recognized. The house was mine, at least for a little while, and with that possession came the clarity I needed to begin turning thought into motion. I had already secured the foundation of my plan with that quiet signature Dad had given me in a moment of panic, and the funds had been shifted into forms that no one in this household would bother to track or even imagine I could access. But money was not the only part of the puzzle. The disappearance had to be seamless, not the result of a tantrum or an argument, but the execution of something so carefully constructed that by the time they realized what had happened, I would be beyond the horizon. That was the difference between a childish rebellion and a liberation. Rebellion seeks acknowledgement. Liberation leaves no space for response. I began with the practical steps because nothing feeds resolve like action. I pulled out the suitcase I had hidden behind the bed frame weeks earlier, one small enough to carry without suspicion, but large enough to contain the essentials I had spent years quietly accumulating. Into it went the jewelry box, the portable drive with every document I cared about, the passport I had applied for on my own, and the clothes I had chosen not for style, but for endurance. Every item placed inside carried a small memory of purchase, and every memory reminded me that I had built a life piecemeal even as they dismissed me, like bricks carried one at a time by someone no one believed strong enough to build. I cleared my room with precision, not stripping it bare in a way that would look like theft, but removing the personal touches that would make anyone hesitate too long at the absence. Posters came down and went into the trash bin behind the grocery store. Journals were fed to the shredder I had bought for work documents, but now turned on myself. And even the digital traces were erased with the kind of patience one learns only after years of being overlooked. My computer looked intact. The folders were still there, but the files inside were hollow shells that pointed to nothing. I did not want confrontation, I wanted absence, and absence had to be clean. The hardest part was not logistics but emotion, because even as I folded and packed, even as I wiped surfaces and carried garbage bags to distant bins, my mind ran through the faces of my parents and the strange softness I had once believed lived behind their choices. A part of me still wanted to march into the kitchen and demand recognition, to throw down every receipt and invoice and proof of sacrifice I had collected and shout that I was not invisible, not disposable, not less. But shouting would only feed their disbelief, confirming for them that I was bitter, that I was jealous, that I was everything they had muttered behind my back when they thought I could not hear. Leaving silently, leaving on my own terms, leaving without permission or explanation, that was the truest answer I could give. I spent that night lying on my stripped bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the hollow creaks of the house as if it were trying to talk me out of what I already knew was irreversible. I thought of the countless nights I had lain in that same spot, replaying the scenes of my childhood where Daniel was cheered for achievements I matched in silence, where he was rewarded for half-finished work while I was told to try harder, where his mistakes were brushed off as youthful experiments and mine were framed as evidence of weakness. The ceiling had been the witness to all of it, and I found myself whispering to it like an old friend, promising that this would be the last night it would have to carry the weight of my quiet frustration. The next morning, I moved with calm certainty. I rented a small storage locker and drove out there under the guise of running errands, depositing the few items I could not carry but did not wish to leave behind. I chose not to bring them with me because I understood the difference between sentiment and burden, and if my new life was to be free, it could not begin with the chains of objects that held me to a past I was determined to shed. I locked the unit, pocketed the key, and drove back without once glancing in the rearview mirror, because this was not a trial run, it was the real thing. Back at the house, I opened the windows wide and let the air sweep through, erasing the last traces of my scent from the rooms. I walked through each space and touched the surfaces, not with affection but with acknowledgement, as though signing off on a chapter one had finally finished. In the kitchen, I wrote a small note on a scrap of paper that simply said, "You always knew who I was, you just never looked," and I placed it inside a cookbook I had bought years ago that no one ever opened. It was not for them, not really, but for me, a final stitch in the tapestry of leaving. By the time the sun set, my bag was packed, my savings secure, and the house restored to the image they wanted to believe in. To anyone else, it would look like a home waiting for its family to return. But I knew better. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands steady, heart strangely quiet, and whispered to myself that by the time their cruise ship docked in Italy, I would be a ghost, a name on their lips that tasted of absence and regret, and a shadow they would never pin down again. I had always believed that revenge, at least the kind that satisfied rather than scorched, was less about spectacle and more about calibration, so while the days of their voyage spilled across the calendar like a slow wave, I spent my hours tuning the details to a pitch that only those who had trained themselves not to hear me would find deafening when silence finally ended, and I did it with the same domestic grace they had always assigned me, moving quietly through rooms, folding the visible world back onto itself and removing not just my presence, but the invisible scaffolding of contributions that had kept their comfort standing. The living room, for instance, looked perfectly normal at a glance, yet the television that had anchored their evenings was gone because it had been bought with my money. The streaming accounts had been deactivated or moved to new emails I alone controlled. And the cheap framed prints that Mom loved because they made the house look polished were dusted and straight, while the only original painting in the house, the one I had found at a flea market and restored on weekends, had been wrapped in acid-free paper, labeled with my name, and carried to the storage unit where it would wait in the dark for a future unconnected to their preferences. In the kitchen, I left the cabinets as neatly arranged as a catalog photograph, though the knife set Dad bragged about to his buddies was missing because I had paid for it in full. The cast-iron skillet, seasoned to satin by years of my hands, had disappeared from the hook with the uncomplicated authority of ownership. And the coffee grinder that produced the only thing we all agreed was sacred had been replaced with a thrift store relic that howled like a cat and produced grit, because if they wanted the good life on my back, they could learn the texture of what remained when I stepped aside. Upstairs was where the air would catch in their throats, not because I left chaos, since chaos explains itself and gives people something to rage against, but because I left order that failed to answer the most basic question of belonging. My room would meet them with a made bed, a dusted dresser, a neat span of carpet, and just enough emptiness to suggest housekeeping rather than evacuation, yet every trace that could tether me, a photograph, a note, a receipt with a doodled margin, had been dissolved into absence, so complete they might wonder whether those memories were more convenient invention than fact. Daniel's room, which had always looked like a sporting goods store after an earthquake, bore a single correction that would pull a small thread through his confidence until it unraveled. In the drawer where he kept loose cash and a scatter of coins he claimed were a travel fund despite being mostly tips he forgot to declare, he would find a folded slip that read in my round. "Unremarkable hand, you told me once money earned by accident doesn't count," so I tidied up the accounting, and even though I took nothing from that drawer, the suggestion would wobble him harder than if I had cleaned him out completely. Because uncertainty is a finer blade than theft when the target is entitlement. The office, which they called the den to make it sound cozy while I did their tax prep on Sunday nights, held the quietest blow. I had compiled a clean ledger of household purchases labeled not with accusations, but with dates, amounts, and simple notes. Router replacement, emergency plumber, winter heating gap covered, Dad's camera lens repair, Mom's charity gala tickets when the bank card had a glitch, Daniel's textbook rush order when he missed the window, and I placed a single printed page at the bottom of the filing drawer beneath the warranties they never read, as though a thoughtful archivist had tucked it there for some future audit, and across the top I had written, "Not see how you used me," or "You owe me," but the driest possible title. Items personally funded by Lila, because I wanted the truth to arrive in the plainest clothes and still be impossible to look away from. It was not a demand for repayment, although part of me savored the thought of them doing math through hot tears, but a mirror angled so precisely that even if they slammed the drawer shut, the reflection would hang behind their eyelids all night. Before I left, I set in motion 2 final turns that most people would call petty and I would call proportionate, because they targeted habits rather than hearts and required no follow-up phone calls or scenes. I transferred the cell plan from the family bundle I had been paying for since the year after college to a solo account in my name, leaving them a notice from the provider that the promotional rate had expired due to changes in plan eligibility, which meant that when they reached for their phones on the drive home from the port, the reception might be spotty and the bill, when it arrived, would be honest, and I closed the grocery delivery account whose free family add-ons had always somehow landed in their cart but not mine, replacing it with an old-fashioned list on the fridge where I had written, in looping letters that would read as cheerful until the meaning set in, "If we need it, we can buy it," a sentence so blameless it could pass for a motivational poster and yet so pointed it cut through the cushion of their assumptions. Neither act would ruin them, which mattered to me more than I wanted to admit, but both would press a finger to the exact bruise they preferred to pretend was muscle. All of this was choreography for a single moment that had lived in my head like a scene from a film I refused to pitch to anyone else, a sequence in which the front door opens, the luggage thumps across the threshold, the voices tumble in bright and tired. And the first realization arrives not as a scream, but as a pause, like a skipped beat on a familiar song. The television that anchors the evening refuses to glow, the coffee tastes like gravel, the den holds a piece of paper that weighs more than the camera in Dad's hands, and somewhere under all that, the house echoes differently, because the person who kept it humming has walked out of the engine room, switched off her console, and taken her manuals with her. I did not need to be standing in the hallway to enjoy that moment, and I did not want to be spying from across the street like a villain in a cheap melodrama, because the point was not to witness their panic, but to force them to live with its origin, which was the exact shape of the space I had occupied without thanks. When everything was set, and the suitcase waited by the door like a dog that knows the route, I walked one last slow circuit to confirm that each thread I had tugged would hold. The windows were latched. The note in the cookbook slept under the recipe for an elaborate tart none of us had ever baked. The inbox filter was catching my name with the efficiency of a small, dedicated sentry. And the key to the storage unit sat cool against my palm like proof that future tense was no longer a theory. I did not leave a letter on the kitchen table, because letters invite rebuttals and rebuttals become arguments that end with the favored child rolling his eyes and the parents insisting that no one meant any harm, and I had finished translating their harm for them. Instead, I left nothing but the vacuum seal of a life removed, which would tell its own story in the evenings when the rooms felt larger yet somehow more cramped. As the taxi idled at the curb and I pulled the door shut behind me with a click that seemed to tune the whole street a degree lower, I looked at the house not with nostalgia but with professional satisfaction. The way a craftsperson might regard a finished piece that does exactly what it promised on the blueprint, and I allowed myself a half-smile that tasted of steel and citrus, because the revenge I had chosen was not jailhouse tough or social media loud, it was the long, intelligent correction of a ledger that had always carried my name in pencil, and now, finally, they would have to read the ink. The driver asked an innocuous question about luggage and flights, and I answered in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, then watched the house recede in the mirror until it became a square of color, and then a thought, and then nothing at all. Because by the time their ship made landfall and their group selfies began to upload into a folder I would never open, the woman they forgot to count had already stepped into her own arithmetic, and the next calculation would not include them. I landed before dawn in a city whose airport announcements rolled like warm water over stone, and as I followed the thin spine of travelers toward the exit, I felt the strange steadiness of someone who has finally stepped into the story she has been writing in the margins for years, because every checkpoint I passed, customs, currency, a prepaid phone with a number no one back home would ever learn, felt less like escape and more like restoration, a gradual return to a center that had been misnamed selfishness by people who benefited from my confusion. The taxi carried me through streets that had not yet decided whether they belonged to night or morning, past shutters painted the color of old postcards and balconies draped with laundry like flags of inconvenient truth. And I told myself that if this first day contained only coffee, a small rented room, and the sound of my own footsteps not hurrying for anyone else, then it would already be enough, because I had promised not grandeur but oxygen. From the narrow window of the room I rented month to month with paperwork that listed me as what I finally am, my own guardian. I watched the sea wrinkle under gulls while my phone vibrated across the table with the chaotic rhythm of a family trying to drag someone back into a play where her role has been taken off the call sheet. And I did not mute the device because silence layered over silence can feel like indifference, while a chorus of missed calls reads like evidence, and evidence has a way of convincing even the person who paid it that the case is closed. The first wave of messages had the bright panic of people who mistake volume for care. Are you okay? Call me now. This isn't funny. Then the tone slid toward accusation as if they were rehearsing themselves into comfort. This is dramatic. You're being cruel. Where did you put the things that belong to the family? Until finally the words softened into nostalgia and apology, which tasted like a sale rack sweater trying to pass for a winter coat. And when Daniel wrote that he had never realized I felt this strongly and that he hoped we can reset, I stared at the sentence long enough to recognize the miracle he thought he was offering, which was not admission of harm, but the charitable restoration of cheer. I drafted no manifesto in reply, because manifestos invite counterpoints, and the last thing I wanted was to resume the role of defense attorney in a life where the prosecution never presents evidence. So I sent one message that contained everything I owed and nothing they could debate. I wrote that the items removed from the house were paid for exclusively by me and documented in the folder labeled with my name in the den. That the bank accounts containing my savings had been consolidated. Because that is what adults do with their resources, that I am safe, that I am not lost, that I am unavailable for conversation until further notice, and that any future contact will be considered through a lens of equal footing rather than guilt. Then I closed the phone and slipped it into a drawer with the deliberate tenderness of setting down a heavy thing I had carried too far. Afternoons stretched like clean linen, and I filled them with work that paid enough and left my mind unscarred. I translated menus for a small tour company whose owner talked to me as if competence were admirable rather than suspicious. I catalogued antiques at a shop where the proprietor called every repaired hinge a resurrection, and in the evenings I walked the length of the promenade until the lights came on and the town decided it was time to forgive itself for the day's small lies. I learned the names of ferry routes and the price of peaches and the way the horizon can look like a promise if you stand at the right angle. And on the third Sunday, I went to a market where an old woman argued fiercely with a fishmonger and then handed me a lemon, as if the truth of life were that simple exchanges are how we remain human. One morning, a final message arrived from Mom that lacked the theater of the previous notes and carried instead the heavy effort of someone staring into a hole that refuses to be measured. She wrote that the list in the den had kept her awake, that she had never added the numbers because she assumed love was a blanket that would hide the draft, that she was sorry in a way that did not ask for my labor to translate, and that she hoped I would write when I was ready. I read it twice, then folded that moment into a place inside me that had always wanted to be seen without being cross-examined, and I answered with fewer words than the ache deserved, telling her that healing is not a rescue mission performed by the person who drowned, that my life is not a punishment of theirs, but the result of mathematics finally done correctly, and that I wish them well from a distance measured not by miles, but by respect. On the last evening before my rent renewed, I walked down to the water and stood with the gulls screaming their ugly joy into the air, and I considered whether revenge had been the engine all along or merely the fuel that got me to the first safe station. Because what followed felt less like triumph and more like the weightless precision of balance restored, a ledger cleared of false entries, a door that shuts softly and does not slam, and I smiled at the thought that somewhere far away a television refused to wake, a coffee grinder growled, a drawer held a page of neat arithmetic, and a cookbook hid a sentence that will hum like an electric wire every time a light is switched on. I will not insist on a conclusion they can applaud or denounce. I will live, and they will live, and somewhere between those two truths hangs a question shaped like a bridge, which may or may not be crossed. And if someday a postcard arrives with no return address and a photograph of a sea that looks like this one, they can decide whether it is a threat or a blessing or just a woman finally sending herself the proof that she exists.